Welcome, everyone, to our event tonight. My name is Francis Shen. I'm a law professor at the University of Minnesota, co-director of the Neurotech Justice Accelerator at Mass General Brigham. And tonight, here in my role as director of the Dana Foundation Career Network in Neuroscience and Society, we're really excited to have all of you here for our event talking about applying to and funding PhD programs in neuroscience. I am going to do some introductions for our fabulous panelists and turn it over to them, but I want to just go over the ground rules and the structure. Very straightforward format tonight. We're in a Zoom meeting by design, so when we get to the Q&A after this, you're welcome to raise your Zoom hand. I'll call on you and you can unmute and ask your question, or if you prefer, you can type your question in the chat and I can ask it for you for our panelists. I'll keep the queue then. We're going to cover some basic questions about the timeline of neuroscience PhD applications, how to format your application, what to put in there, all kinds of sage advice. And if you want more, there are some resources that I'll put in the chat that the Career Network has on our website, neuroxcareers.org. And thanks to the Dana Foundation for supporting this. We are recording, so just know that any questions you ask will be recorded. We'll then post this so that others who are not here live can watch it afterwards. Okay, let me introduce each of our panelists. First will be Dr. Angeline Dukes, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Neuroscience here at the University of Minnesota. She teaches undergraduate neuroscience courses and leads diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in the University of Minnesota Neuroscience program. She also runs, relevant for tonight's conversation, the Minnesota Neuroscience Development Scholars Program, the MINDS program. That's a post-bac program to increase access to neuroscience research opportunities for students like you preparing to pursue doctoral degrees. So tremendous experience. I also want to congratulate Dr. Dukes on being named earlier this year to the very prestigious Forbes 30 Under 30 list. For many reasons, she was selected to that list, including for being the founder and president of Black in Neuro. Thanks for being here, Dr. Dukes. Then we'll hear from Dr. Anthony Wagner. He is a Lucy Stern Professor in the Department of Psychology and a Deputy Director of the Wu Tsai Neurosciences Institute at Stanford University. He is on the board of Stanford Center for Cognitive and Neurobiological Imaging, and relevant to tonight, has played a lot of roles in the department. And therefore has a lot of experience in looking at applications and is going to have some really helpful advice. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Wagner for being one of the neuroscientists who's been most involved in neuroscience and law. He's been an expert testifying in court. He's published many guides for judges and for lawyers. So thanks, Dr. Wagner, for all of that work and for being here tonight. Third, we'll hear from Dr. Adriana Gavan, who is a professor of psychology at and also the Dean of Undergraduate Education for the last 5 years. She has expertise in adolescent brain development and is the director of the Developmental Neuroscience Laboratory, looking at characterizing the neural mechanisms underlying adolescent behavior. And it's really cool with specifically an eye towards informing policy. And Dr. Gavan is another neuroscientist who spent a lot of time with us on the law side, testifying in a landmark case recently in Massachusetts that raised the age at which emerging adults could be sentenced to life without possibility of parole, and has been a colleague in many ways. So thanks to all of you for taking an hour of your time tonight to be here with us. I'll put links to the bios for each of our panelists so you can learn more, but I will be quiet now and turn it over to Dr. Dukes. And our question to kind of get us started is, can you help us think about this mysterious process, the basics, the timeline, what's involved? Thanks for being here, and floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. So I thought I would just go over a couple of the basics. As mentioned, I currently co-direct a post-baccalaureate program, and so I spend a lot of time talking with my students about how to get into neuroscience PhD programs, what's the process of it. We do mock interviews, we do a lot of different things, and so thought it'd be helpful to just go over some of the basics. I want to clarify this is a US-based perspective, right? So this could differ across different countries, and so it's important to pay attention to what those requirements and what that timeline might look like depending on the country that you're interested in applying to. But this is for United States-based perspectives. So in general, in the US, December 1st is usually the deadline for graduate school applications. That does vary. Some schools have earlier November deadlines or mid-November deadlines. So make sure that you're checking each website for the schools that you're interested in applying to. What I would actually recommend and what I usually have my students do is make a spreadsheet of every school that they're interested in applying to, put the location, put the deadlines that the applications are due. You can include like their stipends and their benefits and like whatever support they have. Just having everything organized that way you don't accidentally miss a deadline is super helpful. Usually for the timeline, what I recommend is that, you start at least looking into your programs and working on your statements by the fall, right? So like beginning of fall, you should be starting that process because there's a lot of different statement types, and I don't know if we're going to get into some of that, but they do vary. And so, in general, all programs want the same information regardless of the types of statements that they're asking for. Usually, an effective statement will weave together in a coherent narrative these main questions. So like who are you? They want to know your background, like who you are as a person. What is it that you're interested in doing? They want to know what have you done? So that's your prior research experiences, right? And what will make you a good graduate student. They also want to know what are your next steps, right? So you're applying to this program. Why are you applying to this program? Okay. Um, and then they also want to know where will this lead you? So what are your long-term goals, right? What is it that you want to do next after graduate school? So in some ways, regardless of the names of the statements that they're asking for, they're usually asking for some variations of these programs or some variations of those questions. And then the last little bit that I just wanted to touch on is that, as you're applying for graduate school, neuroscience PhDs are an average of like 5 and 5.5 years. And I know that can sound like a really long time, but it does fly by. And those years will pass regardless of whether you're in a PhD program or not. And so might as well be doing something that you're really excited about. But they want to make sure through these statements and, of course, the interviews that you're really committed. And, these are things that you're really excited about and want to do. I know that a common question that like students have is if they need to reach out to specific faculty beforehand, but for at least a lot of the US-based neuroscience PhD programs, you do rotations in your first year, and so it's not super necessary to, but if there is someone that you're super excited about working with, if you're like, I'm applying to this school because I want to work with this person, then it could be helpful to reach out to see if they would be taking students the following year, right? So like the year that you would be, joining the program or even the year after if you're doing rotations in that first year, you just want to make sure that they'd actually be accepting students because what you don't want to do is apply to a program where there's only one faculty you're excited about working with and then they're not taking students. So hopefully that helps set the stage a little bit for some of the questions you might have.
Great, thank you. Dr. Wagner, let me spotlight you and maybe you can just share tips, suggestions, add on to that, and maybe say a little bit more about the perspective you have. I know you've played different roles in the department, including, I believe, playing a deep role in the Department of Graduate Study, in the graduate studies sort of admissions process.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thanks, Angelina, for kicking us off. I'll build on what Angelina just shared and address some of the sort of prompts that Francis, you just raised. I also have, I bring the perspective of my own lived experiences. I've, only know the few departments and institutions that I've been at. And so this is coming both from a US perspective as well as from these departments, but I imagine that there's a lot of commonality across. One thing that I want to sort of build on, well, a couple of things, building on what Angelina noted. One, take a look early on at the programs that you might be interested in, the universities, and in particular, the faculty, the labs that you might be interested in. And sometimes what you need to do is kind of reach out to faculty to find out what is the right program to apply to at the institution that they're at. So just thinking about, here at Stanford, but I think this is true at a lot of universities, neuroscientists can apply to different graduate programs and to do neuroscience work. We have a neuroscience track in the Department of Psychology. I chair graduate admissions in psychology. I've been on the graduate admissions committee for our neuroscience program as well. And so I have students who come in through our neuroscience PhD program. I have students who come in through psychology PhD program, neuroscience track. And so have a sense of what programs exist in order to do neuroscience at a given institution. Some might be in an engineering, department, et cetera. And it can be helpful to reach out if there are multiple programs that a targeted lab or set of labs are a part of to reach out to the faculty member and say, do you have a recommendation? And part of this will be, what kind of training do you want as a emerging scientist? Do you want the kind of curriculum that a focused neuroscience program would you work through, which might go from cell molecular up to systems and clinical and applied and computational? Are you looking for focused training, maybe in human systems neuroscience, maybe through a psychology program in neuroscience? So have some sense of what you're interested in. And that's the second point I want to sort of echo Angelina's comment. It's a commitment to apply to graduate school. It goes quickly, average, 5.5 years, so some are out in 5, some are out in 6, hopefully not too much longer than that, right? But it is a commitment of time. Know that you're applying because it's something that you're really excited about, you're passionate about, you want to do this, because that's going to make, everything that you do, all careers, there's really exciting parts of it. And then there's sort of the slog of it all, working through and getting your data and the ups and downs and, the peaks and valleys of sort of a research program. And being excited about it is what allows you to, hold on to the big goal and what you're trying to achieve during those more challenging moments. In terms of maybe the one other thing, because I know this is a discussion, one other thing I might sort of seed here is, how should you position yourself? When should you be applying to a graduate program? And I think a lot of programs, the labs, faculty, the programs are going to be looking for somebody who is in fact, excited about and able to sort of describe a problem that they're interested in, broadly writ, as well as then a set of research experiences, as well as sort of, theoretical or conceptual training around that broad set of problem. And sometimes you can get those experiences during your undergraduate period, but sometimes you may be in a context where you don't have as many opportunities as in other contexts, and you might be faced with a decision: should I do a post-bac program, get a post-bac master's? Should I apply now to graduate school with the kind of training and experience I have at this point in time? Should I go and instead of doing a co-term program, take a post-bac research assistant, get an RA position, and work full time in a lab for a couple of years? And the answer to that, there's not a singular answer to that. And it really will depend on the opportunities that you have in front of you, whether there's, an RA position, a paid RA position that you can take. I will say that I tend to give the normative guidance that often going and doing a full-time research assistantship is a better path if you can secure one than a post-bac program. Post-bac program, you still are splitting time with coursework. You're paying the institution that you're doing your post-bac at. You're getting some additional training, but you're not going to get the same level of training as if you were able to get an RA-ship and be able to work 40 hours a week and also get a salary rather than having to pay to get that training. And so that'll be a factor that some of you might need to think through, and just to hope that sort of weighing in here and at least flagging it. I'm sure we'll have more discussions about things like this during our time together, but just flagging it as something important to think through.
Before we go to
Go
Dr.
ahead.
Galvin, could I follow up one question, because it's on my mind, and you, what is the difference between doing a PhD in psychology, where you study a lot of neuroscience, versus doing a PhD in neuroscience? And as you've noted, the same school may have both of those things, and they're separate and they're separate applications. Could you say a little bit more about the difference in what the experience is, and then also does it make a difference for what your options are later? And I don't know if others maybe want to jump in on that as well. We can just open it up. Sorry, but I just wanted to ask, since
Yeah,
you just
that's
raised
great.
it.
I'll
This
be
is
very brief on this because I'm sure Adriana and Angelina have comments and thoughts here as well. I would say once you're a few years into the program, the differences, there are not large differences in what you're doing day to day as a scientist and as an early career training in science. So I have graduate students in my lab who are in the psych PhD program, NeuroTrack, the neuroscience PhD program, bioengineering, other graduate programs. And by the time they're maybe a third year, definitely by the time they're fourth year, they're all roughly having the same kinds of experiences. They're in the mix in the lab, their lab's positioned in a particular sort of physical location. And so they're interacting with the other labs at that location, and they're interacting with other neuroscience communities, relevant communities across campus. It's the early years that where the training can really differ. You can, in a neuroscience program, a lot of neuroscience programs, as was flagged, there's normatively a rotation. Not every, but I think a lot of them have a rotation. So you spend your first year rotating between, if you're at a quarter school like I'm at, you might rotate across 3 different labs, and you do sort of 9, 10 week sort of, exposures, projects in each of these sort of labs. And those labs can vary in terms of across scale or approach to neuroscience. You might be working on cell molecular 1 quarter, but then you might want to, I want to try to get some exposure to systems neuroscience. I had some cell molecular background as an undergrad, so I started there, but I'd really like to learn about systems neuroscience and non-human models, or maybe I want to learn about human brain imaging and systems neuroscience in humans. Concurrently, you're taking a lot of core courses focused on neurobiology and underlying neurobiological mechanisms that give rise to all kinds of clinical conditions, to behavior, et cetera, right? And so that's pretty broad, but you might be taking classes across levels, again, cell molecular, into circuits, into computational, into systems. In a psychology program, you're going to not have, there are programs with rotations, but a lot of them you wander in and you might actually have a home lab initially from the get-go. And a lot of programs allow you to switch between labs, but a lot of programs you start in a particular lab. So that'll be different. You may or may not have rotations. You might be taking core training courses that gives you a broader perspective on human behavior and psychological science. Not just neuroscience, but psychological science, from cognition to developmental processes to social, psychological processes, et cetera. Training and statistics, et cetera. And so the front end first couple of years can be quite different experiences. The good thing is neuroscience is interdisciplinary, just like psychological science is interdisciplinary. So there's lots of crosstalk between labs, between programs, and you can get what you want even if you enter a program and you're like, oh, I really wish I had a little more of this and a little bit of that, you can likely get that at the institution in the program that you're in, whatever you enrolled in. I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, thanks. That was helpful. And Dr. Galvan, I don't know if you want to just start there for a moment, and then we've got a lot of other questions that you could cover.
Yeah.
So thanks for being here.
Happy to. And I would echo everything that Anthony just said, that the primary differences are early on. And maybe I'll be a little bit autobiographical here, that I went I got a PhD in a neuroscience program, and I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for the coursework and to have a neuroscientific perspective on the studies I do in psychology. I'm a professor of psychology now. But at the time, I think I was feeling as though I should have gone to get a PhD in a psychology program, because the courses that I would have been really interested in taking were not offered in my neuroscience program, which was at a medical school. So I didn't have access to a psychology program. And also, as Anthony mentioned, the rotations that I did were based in very cellular neuroscience. And again, now it's helpful to have that information and content knowledge. But at the time, I think I would have rather spent my time in diving right into a psychology lab. Having said that, the other consideration is what your peers are working on. So one reason that I felt as though a PhD program in neuroscience maybe wasn't the best fit at the time is because my peers were all working on those cellular questions, whereas I was interested in human behavior, and I was in the one lab that studied human behavior. And so I only had cohort in my lab, not so much across the program. And so it was, I would have made a different decision, but in the end, I landed in a great lab, and it was great. And I landed in a psychology department as a faculty member. So that really worked out. Another thing I wanted to touch on is that I went straight to graduate school right after college. And I, again, underscore what Anthony said about the benefits of working for a year or more before going to graduate school. I think if I had done that, I would have had a better perspective and understanding of why a PhD program in psychology would have been a better fit for me at the time. But it was, I had momentum. I felt like it was a good thing to do. I knew I wanted to get a PhD in neuroscience. So it felt as though, why not just go for it now? But upon reflection, I see the benefits of getting that extra training and learning what it's like to be in a lab, to grapple with some of the uncertainty that happens when you're conducting science. That's the beauty of science, that you set out to solve a problem that has not yet been solved. So there are going to be a lot of unknowns that you will grapple with as a PhD student. So maybe I'll stop there. I think you're on mute, Francis.
Sorry, yeah, let me spotlight everyone. And I want to actually ask a question that's direct follow-up to what you just said and get and Anthony, you referenced this. A question that we get a lot is whether master's programs are an important step. Often a student may feel, I think, that their application, they don't feel is quite as strong as they'd like it to be, or maybe they want some additional coursework. Or maybe they sort of came to neuroscience late in college, and so they, master's programs are expensive, but they could be valuable. I'm just wondering what each of you think about that. I've had this specific conversation like several times just in the last few weeks. I'm sure some of our students are thinking about it also.
I'd be happy to chime in a little bit in there. And I think what Anthony was describing earlier was actually more of a master's program than a post-bac program. So usually the differences, as I try to explain them to my students, are that masters are really great if you maybe don't have the best GPA, you need some additional coursework. It's great for like, you know that you'll be there for 2 years, ideally doing research. But you do have to pay for them, right? And they can be very expensive. Like master's programs can be very expensive. The research assistant position that Anthony was describing is like where you're getting paid to do research, but you're only doing research. Whereas a post-bac position is a very unique third type option where usually there's a program involved. And for a lot of the post-bac programs, especially the neuroscience ones that have been more prevalent in the past few years, you get paid to do the research and you get additional support for like applying to graduate school. So the way that our program is structured, it's 34 hours a week where they're doing research full time in a research lab. But then those other 6 hours, we do weekly meetings where we get together and we go over like how to create your CV and resume. We do peer feedback, we do mock interviews, we do all of the things, the additional support that you might need to be prepared for graduate school, both for the application process and after. And so that's a very like unique type of maybe third thing that isn't quite a master's or like just a research assistant position, but like you get both sides of that where it's a paid research position and you get to do more of the graduate school preparation.
That sounds great. I didn't know that. That sounds like a really great program.
Can I ask again another follow-on, which is I think some students that I've talked with feel a little bit in a cycle where they don't have the research experience yet. That's why they want to do the PhD. And in particular, they don't have a publication with their name on it. Could you guys give us the behind the scenes view of where is the bar with respect to looking at applicants, some of whom have multiple publications, in part because maybe they went to a college where you could jump into a program and by sophomore year you're, in a summer high-end program or something. But just what is expected, what's not in terms of both research experience and specifically publications with your name on it. When applying, just applying to graduate school, not for jobs, but just applying to graduate school.
I'm happy to, sorry. Go
No,
ahead.
please go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm happy to weigh in. I'd be interested in hearing both of your perspectives on this. From my perspective, having a publication or not does not matter. Applying to graduate school. What matters is you have some conceptual theoretical training in the problem space that you've expressed interest in. You obviously don't know everything. None of us know everything, but you're earlier in your career. You can't know everything, but you've got some understanding of the current state of some of the problems in the field and problems that you're interested in. And you've begun to build skill sets that are going to allow you to hit the ground running when you enter grad school, so that as you're doing additional theoretical training, you're learning and mastering and reading the literature, and you're building new skill sets as you're doing your science. You're not starting from scratch, right? Yep. And so that's where, whether it's a post-bac program, whether it's a post-graduation full-time RA-ship, whether it's a master's program where if you need the theoretical, the coursework training and maybe some training in statistics, et cetera, or programming, or setting yourself up. So I'm looking for somebody, just for, I'll just, use my lab as an example. I'm looking for a student who has some background. My lab focuses on, the psychological neural basis of learning and memory and interactions then between memory systems and mechanisms of attention and goal-directed behavior or sort of cognitive control. So I'm looking for individuals who have some background in one of those problem spaces, as well as some experience with some set of experimental skills, approaches, behavioral studies, maybe with eye tracking or with EEG or with functional imaging or something. You don't have to have publications. You don't, you don't have to have years and years of experience in these spaces, but somebody who has clearly established a skill set that then one can build from as they enter the graduate program and continue to train and develop their research. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I was going to say similar for me. A publication doesn't advance someone more than a student who doesn't have a publication, in part because I'm really looking for someone who, if they are on a publication or not, or what research project they worked on in any of these areas, that they can explain the research problem, the question that they worked on, the methods they use, more than simply saying, I was asked to run 10 subjects or whatever the task was, because I want to understand, I want to know that there's a deeper understanding of why they were doing the project and what about that project or a related project motivated them to apply to graduate school and specifically to my lab that would help them achieve the goals that they want to achieve as a neuroscientist. So my interest in a publication, it's great, and it's great if they have a publication, they could really describe it well and it was really their own work and intellectual contribution, but it doesn't make a difference.
Thanks for that. All right, so we're going to open it up to questions. As we do that, two ways to ask questions are already some in the chat, which I'll turn to in just a moment. You can also, students, if you want to, attendees, you want to sort of raise your Zoom hand, you can do that. Ian, I'll call on you either way. One last question, though, for me before we go to the floor, which is reference letters, recommendation letters. How many do, most programs typically want? And who, obviously, of course, a recommendation, they should know you, but like what are some good tips for who should write your letters, I think, and how important are they in the process also, I suppose?
I'm happy to chime in a bit on this because I get asked to write letters quite a bit. So I'm teaching faculty as part of my job here, and I teach classes with like 110 students, right? And so if you are a student in my class and all you do is come to class, take the exams, and leave, I don't know you, right? Like I have no idea who you are. Do not know if you're present or if you're asleep in class. If you have never taken the time to actually come to office hours and talk to me, to tell me about your goals, to like ask for help in the class, literally anything, it will not be a strong letter from me. And so I usually decline writing letters to students if they have not come to my office hours at least 3 times. If we haven't had 3 separate conversations, they can just send an email to meet and for us to chat. But if I don't feel like I can write them a strong letter, I will not. So one of the best things that you can ask as you're asking for letters of rec is to ask the person, do you have time to write me a strong letter of recommendation? That way, if they don't feel like they can write you a strong letter, they could say, no, I don't have time, right? That's okay, because what you don't want is a bad letter. So usually you need about 3 letters of recommendation. It's best to get them from people that you have done research with. So that's obviously like one of the best letters, right? So any type of research, whether it was a summer research program, doing research during the school year, those are the best ones. The second best ones are from your faculty members, right? People that you've taken a class with. Ideally, a science class is great, or some type of STEM class is usually really wonderful. And then the third option is also I write letters for like folks in my program. So like if you did any type of program with someone, usually that's another really great option. So ideally some mix of those are what you're trying to aim for, but you want them to be good letters. And the best way to get good letters is to communicate with those people that you're asking well in advance, right? Making sure that they get to know you, you get to know them. And then something that I usually recommend for my students, some faculty, so like I recently started creating a form, a Google form that I have people fill out with like information, key things they want me to highlight or characteristics or like things that they did that they're really excited about that they want to make sure I touch on in their letter. But usually what I recommend for everyone is to just send a couple of like bullet points of like really important things you want them to highlight, because every single letter shouldn't say the exact same thing, right? You want them to like touch on other areas, like you're an excellent researcher, you're going to be really great as a student, you're going to be wonderful as someone who is like a good member of the community, you'll be involved in committees and giving back and all of that, right? So you can have these letters touch on so many different areas, and you can ask, the letter writers if they can touch on some of those areas for you.
Great, thanks. And give your letter writers enough time, everyone. I write a lot of letters too.
I just want to make a comment about what a good and bad letter means and maybe what we mean by that, because I think all the points you made are exactly right. A bad letter is one, it's not one where they're going to trash you and say this is a terrible student. No one, I don't think, would say that. It's a letter that doesn't really give an insight to the reader about who you are and your potential to be successful in a graduate program. And so the more information that person has about you, that's what we mean by a good letter, that they can speak to your motivations, your skills, maybe some hurdles you've overcome that would be important for them to know. So that's what we mean by good and bad letter.
Thanks. This is great. All right, we've got a great queue of questions. Keep them coming. I'm just going to kind of work from the top to the bottom. Something that you discussed earlier was that some programs start with rotations and others you sort of know which lab you're with from the beginning. And the question is kind of twofold: pros and cons for these two, and does one of the other type of programs usually take longer?
I'm happy to offer an initial perspective on this. Um, there are pros and cons, but they intersect with the individual, right? For some individuals, you've got a sense of what level of analysis you want to work at, what kind of neuroscience problems broadly writ you want to work out on, and maybe some sort of spaces in which you want to use that approach to whether it's a clinical domain or behavior, uh, you know, um, other possible sort of application cases, but you don't quite know what you're excited about. And so, rotating allows you to get exposed to a number of labs that maybe are using, a similar approach, or maybe you're not quite sure you're interested in a problem, but you're not quite sure what scale of analysis you want to work on that problem on. And so you might get exposed to labs that are, again, across scale, one lab rotation cellular system up to computational or a systems approach. And so that could really kind of help you kind of find a lab that feels right for you in terms of the scope of the problem. And also when people are, students are rotating, sometimes they're also looking for a cultural fit, the mentoring style, how it fits with sort of you as an individual, the culture of the lab, et cetera. I would say the costs are, if you have a sense of what you want to do and you enter a program where there are required rotations, some of those rotations may not be as useful for you relative to having that time back to actually be driving that initial research that you're doing in that first year. And so you can get the end of the first year and not really have a substantial research project that you might have actually, moved forward or even completed. And now in your analysis and maybe in the write-up mode. And so there are sort of the pace with which you scale up ultimately what is going to be your graduate research could differ whether you have rotations or not. I don't know, maybe for some students it might result in a little bit of delay. I would say whether you're in a rotation program or not, my guess is field wide. Average graduation rates are probably around somewhere between 5 and 6 years, probably around 5.5 with, many students, completing in that window. And so I don't know if it's going to have a big impact unless you go through the rotation and there isn't really a great fit for you and you come out of it with a bit of a struggle of not being a bit uncertain about where you're going to go.
Thanks. Let me try and combine two, almost three questions, and they're all really about doing research while an undergrad. So question one is, if you're not in a position to get a postbac or RA job, but you have some long-time research experience in an undergrad lab, is it still a good idea to apply right after the BA? Second question is, for all 4 years or 2, 3, 4 years, or be a part of different labs in different areas? Those are two questions, but sort of a similar brand.
I can, the question about being in multiple labs or sticking with one lab, if I wouldn't recommend being in 4 or 5 labs over your time. I think that would make it very challenging to get more than a simple, shallow understanding of the research project or of the research questions. So I would probably suggest sticking to a more in-depth understanding in one particular lab. But if that lab is working on something you're completely uninterested in, I think it's okay to pivot and to search for a different one that would better suit the interest of the individual. But in general, more isn't better in this case, or I wouldn't view that in that way. And the first question about whether it's okay or maybe advise if it's advised to apply right after college, if you've been working in a lab, you know that's what you want to study. I don't see why not if that's a clear path for you.
And just, I think this is an easy one to clarify. There was a question, do you need a master's to get into a PhD? I think the answer is clearly no, though it raises a question sort of, um, what are you seeing with most of your applicants? Do most of them have a little, something in the middle, whether it's a post-bac or a little work after or a master's, or are most coming right out of college? What are you
Yeah,
seeing?
I think that there has been a shift lately where graduate school programs are becoming more competitive. So most of the applicants do tend to have some type of, year or two after undergrad where either they worked as an RA, they did a post-bac program, or they did a master's, but you don't have to do a master's. You actually get a master's in a lot of programs along the way of the PhD, where like after you advance to candidacy, you earn a master's degree too. So it's not a requirement to have a master's, but it does again just depend on like what do you need. If you feel like your GPA from undergrad wasn't high enough and you want to do more coursework, then maybe a master's is a good option then, and that can, help show that you are a more competitive applicant. But if you feel like your GPA is great and you just need more research experience, I would say just go for the job that will pay you as opposed to paying for a master's degree.
Thanks. And that hit on one of the questions which asked to compare them. Let me combine another two questions which talk about sort of how one demonstrates and speaks meaningfully about interest in a particular area. So one question asks, what happens when one is making a slight shift in area of interest? In some cases, it becomes a little difficult to get insight problems without having previously done a research to understand the details and decision made in the literature. And the next question is very related. It said, beyond work within a lab, are there other ways of proving interest in a specific field of neuroscience would something such as literature reviews qualify? And I get the sense that, this might be a student who they've done some research, but now they're reflecting, and maybe they've discovered a new topic, which is awesome, and they know this is what they want to do, but their research isn't or previous work isn't congruent with that, other than saying, "Hey, I'm really interested in this." Like, how do they demonstrate in an application that this is a genuine area of interest and that they know something about it and would be great to contribute to your lab? Oh, Anthony, if you're talking, you're muted.
Sorry, I hit
Yeah.
unmute, but it didn't unmute. Thank you, Francis. I think how I, as an applicant, would navigate that situation depends upon the nature of the shift, right? You could have a shift in problem domain, moving from interests in what are mechanisms of memory, learning and memory, to some other space like mechanisms of attention or, some other sort of domain of cognition, say, where maybe some of your training, coursework, and, time in a lab, in a memory lab, doesn't actually provide you as rich a background in the literature on attention, say, just as an example. But there's a lot of transfer in terms of the skill sets, designing experiments of a particular kind, leveraging linear mixed models and other kinds of statistical tools to work with data, imaging approaches or other kinds of physiological measures that you might collect. I appreciate that a lot of that I'm bringing forward is at the human systems level. So but that there is some knowledge transfer. In that case, I think I would apply, and I would read up and I would start reading the literature, read reviews, maybe, and try to figure out online course, get additional sort of prep in that problem space. On the other hand, if it's a fundamental, it's a more major shift, you were a biology student and you were working on, something about plant biology, but now you're interested in neuroscience, and, and there's both going to need to be, theoretical learning as well as methodological learning. I think I might try to identify opportunities to build some of those skills before heading off to a graduate program. Or at least before applying, I think it'll increase the probability you'll get into a program that that will serve you well. And also, when you get there, will allow you to sort of hit the ground running a little bit more.
Thank you for that. I want to transition. We had a couple of questions. It was on my notes anyway to make sure we get to it, and that is paying for these programs, funding. There was a question about stipends, so I think I'll just ask it this way. Could you give us a sense of are all neuroscience programs funded? What is a stipend? What should, I mean, I don't know if you give an exact number, but like what should you be expecting with stipend? Is there variation? And then how else can you fund this? And the question I had was, should some students, it seems to be they apply for fellowships or scholarships sort of in parallel with the application process? There's a lot of questions, but they're all basically how do you pay for this? Um, I don't know, Adriana, if you want to start on any of that.
Yeah, the first thing is yes, there's variation, and as far as I know, and please, my colleagues, correct me if I'm wrong, all PhD programs do provide a stipend, right, for while you're in the program. But how that stipend is covered varies. Some universities provide a first-year stipend, and then the rest of the time there you will be TAing or doing some other type of service work to pay for your stipend. Other times you may apply for a fellowship through the National Institutes of Health or National Science Foundation. They provide fellowships that you can use to cover your stipend, but then maybe sometimes also your research costs. And other times your PI, your mentor, may have at UCLA we call it a graduate student researcher, which means that they pay you off of their grant or some other funding mechanism they have for you to conduct your research and your studies.
And one thing I want to point out, because I think the question was also asking about, is it the right way to think about stipends based on like who's paying you more? You have to take into account cost of living in different cities, right? So some cities that might be in like New York City or in Los Angeles might have a higher stipend, but that's because the cost of living there is also higher. So the stipend in proportion to the cost of living in the city is an important factor to consider.
Great. Let me follow on with that, which is I think it's a topic on everyone's mind, and that is there anything? Is the question? Is there anything to be aware of with this upcoming application cycle, with all the recent cuts in funding of research? Now, this is asking you to predict some things that are hard to predict, but I guess what advice are you giving your own students who are thinking about doing this? It's a very uncertain moment. Yeah, I guess there's the question. What advice?
Yeah, so without being sort of um, naive and missing the moment, I would encourage you to, if you think you want to do science, you want to be a scientist and leverage the scientific method to have an impact in some way on the human condition and on society, be optimistic and apply to a graduate program. Get that training. And I know it's a particularly challenging moment, but I wouldn't let the moment dissuade you from pursuing this passion and this possible sort of, career in life that you can have in front of you. I think it's hard to know right now where we're going to be with respect to grad aid and therefore the number, how competitive it's going to be. You can imagine it might actually be, in theory, the current moment might lead some individuals to opt out of applying to graduate programs. Maybe intuitively, it might be a little less competitive because some folks decide, oh, science looks a little scary right now. I'm not going to go into try to get science training. We don't know. We don't know whether there's going to be significant changes in levels of grant support to individual labs, as well as to some training programs that, support some of the graduate program sort of stipends. It's possible that there could be significant hits coming. There were, some hits this year. It's possible it won't be anywhere near as problematic for many labs and many programs. I think, time will tell. So I would really be, this gets to actually Angeline's comment about sort of comparing stipends and whatnot. I would base your decision on, what am I excited about? What graduate program should I enroll in? Well, what science here and what training opportunity seems to be, the best for me, my best, and you're gonna, be doing your best to make that decision. It's going to be an uncertain decision. Going to any one of N programs that perhaps if you get into N programs, you likely will excel in all of them. But which one am I most excited about? I wouldn't base it on the stipend. I understand everybody, we're coming from different circumstances, and I don't want to be insensitive there, but you're making a commitment to yourself, a long-term commitment. Select if you want to do science, apply, where you decide to go, what are you the most excited about? Where do you think is your best bet that you're going to come out of that training program as well positioned to do the kind of science and be the kind of scientist you want to be?
I want to go back and thanks for that. I want to ask a related question to make sure we pick up a few of these. What advantages does a PhD offer, and what kind of paths can you build with it? We started this conversation. How do you get into a program? But maybe zoom out for a second. One thing, of course, is be a faculty in a neuroscience department or psychology department, it seems. But what else can you do with this PhD? And what are your graduates doing?
I think that's one of the most exciting things is that there's so many different things you could do with a PhD, like in neuroscience. There are so many different areas that you can go into. And I actually really try to encourage my students to explore all of the options, right? Like you can go into science writing, you can go into medical illustration, you can go into science policy, into anything like related to government, different types of industry. So like pharma and biotech and like all of these different areas. Like there are so many things you can do. You can, of course, stay in academia, but even within academia, there's so many different roles that aren't just your typical like idea of running a research lab and like doing that full time. Like there are unique roles like mine where like you're teaching faculty or you do like DEI work, or you do outreach work and community engagement work. You could be like a director of a core or a center. You can do so many things. Like honestly, there is so many different career paths. And I think people feel very stuck in that, oh, if I get a PhD in neuroscience, I must be a full-time researcher, only run a lab, and that's the only thing that I can do. And that's just not true. Like there are so many things that you can do. And so I would strongly encourage you to just explore, like talk to other people. You can also ask for the programs that you're interested in, like really what Francis was saying of just like asking what are some of the careers that graduates have gone into. And I think especially now, a lot of people are exploring like it used to be called alternative careers, but they're just other career options, right? They're just all career options. And so there's just a ton. And I think the more that you ask around, you'll be surprised of all the things that you could do.
Yeah, that's so well said, Angeline, because that is what's exciting about getting a PhD. And one of the reasons that there are so many career opportunities with having a PhD in neuroscience or a different discipline is not even exactly about the content knowledge, but the skills you gain as a scientist in writing. You have to have excellent writing skills, communication skills, project management skills, collaborative skills, all of those things. Even if you decide you never want to study memory again, if you're in Anthony's lab, you will take with you those really important skills that will be applicable to any career you choose beyond neuroscience.
And I think there are a lot of industry options as well, right? It's my understanding.
Absolutely. I'll echo all of that. In addition to those skills, there's another fundamental set of skills, right? So in addition, there's also technical skills.
Yes.
Learn to think like a scientist and break down a problem and be systematic and logical. All of that's great. You also learn to problem solve and reason through challenges. Your research program is nonlinear. It's not like you have the idea, you do the experiment, the data work out perfectly, you have there are so many twists and turns along the way, and you learn to reason through and figure out how to navigate and actually, with support, but also self-directed, get to the other side of those problems. And so my students, half of my students are, Google, Facebook, wherever, and they're deeply sought after. because they have this science training, they understand, human behavior. That's helpful if you're on that side of the neuroscience end. But really, it's the data science skill sets, the programming skill sets, the problem solving, being able to overcome hurdles and challenges. And, there's
Being
all
com-
kinds
yeah,
of training that you get.
being comfortable with uncertainty is so valuable to know that it's okay. It'll pass. It won't be
Yeah.
linear, but it is just as valuable a lesson.
Let me add a couple more. I think we got 7 minutes. We can squeeze a bunch in. So combining two, earlier, it was suggested that you don't have to reach out to individual PIs, but I assume that you'd agree you could. So I want to ask, how do you recommend finding potential PhD PIs? Like Google, search by university department, and then relatedly, how should I go about reaching out to faculty for PhD programs? So you do search somehow, you find someone, you've never met them. um, yeah, how do you navigate that? There are also a lot of neuroscientists out there, so how do you find them?
Maybe I'll take the first part of it and others want to
Okay.
jump in. One way is, yes, you can Google, but sometimes pages are outdated. What papers are you reading that interest you? And read papers on PubMed. By papers, I mean manuscripts, journal articles on PubMed, and see what draws your attention. What papers would you read, or do you read when it's not assigned to you by a class or something like that? And I think that's a really important way, because folks who are publishing means that they probably have a very active program of research and are seeking and interested in training graduate students. But Angelina, I have a feeling you have a good bit of advice about how to approach potential PIs.
Yeah, I do, mostly because my students are always like, I really like this person, but I'm so scared to meet them or to like reach out to them. And it can feel intimidating. I think the first thing is like, remember that PIs are people too, right? So, like it takes away some of that fear and intimidation. Like they are human beings. They are once in your shoes. They are usually excited to talk to folks who are excited about the work that they do, right? Like everyone loves talking about themselves. So they do get really excited to tell you all about the research that they do. So there are a couple different ways to do like that first interaction. One of them is whoever you're currently doing research with or someone that you have done research with, you could ask if they know them and if they're willing to make like an e-introduction for you. Sometimes having another person send like that email can, assuage some of those worries and fears, and just to make that initial connection, and then you can follow up afterwards. If you are going to cold email a faculty member, I would recommend keeping it brief, right? Nobody wants to read like a page-long email. Keeping it very brief, and it can just say, who you are, that you are, applying for graduate school, what makes you interested in their work, usually stating that, I read a recent paper of yours, I found that this, finding was very interesting, like whatever the finding was, or if you have a question that you want to ask them about it. Normally that helps with the engagement. And then one thing that you can ask for is for a brief 30-minute meeting to like, talk more about their research. Now, by doing that, right, you have to keep in mind that they're probably getting tons of emails from a lot of different students, right? And so people sometimes just don't have time to meet with everybody, and that's okay. So what you could do is either to ask to meet with them or someone in their lab to learn more about, their lab and the research that they do and all of that. So that's an option there. And also if they're like, I just don't have time to meet, that's totally fine, right? Like no worries there. What I would recommend doing is if you do end up applying to that school and you get an interview, then you can send a follow-up email of like, I emailed you a few months ago. I know you didn't have time to meet. I hope to see you during the interview weekend, right? And then they can be like, oh, this person reached out to me, and hopefully they can make time to meet with you during the interview weekend. So it is a little bit about being persistent in it, but it's just getting over that first hurdle of like trying to send that initial email. I know it can feel a little scary, but you're not the only one who's trying to do it. And I think if you can make a connection, right, based on like their previous research or having like another faculty member reach out on your behalf, that usually helps ease some of that in too.
All right, couple rapid fire questions here. We'll get into the bowels of neuroscience here. How can someone with the cell molecular biology undergraduate training apply to a PhD in computational systems neuroscience?
I'm happy to, in that particular case, and my lab, we do a little bit of computation, but not really much. We're not a computational lab. And so I can only speak to this from having seen it at the programmatic level when we make graduate admissions, interview decisions, and ultimately admit decisions. I think for a number, for a lot of computational labs, having some background in that particular space can be helpful. Shifting and not having some foundational computational skill sets can make it hard to get into a lab that you might be interested in. So it's a little bit like, I don't have a cell molecular background. If I'm applying to a cell molecular lab, what might I do? I need to figure out how to go and begin to get at least a little bit of training in that space so that when I'll be more likely to be attractive as an admit, and then I can be more likely to be hitting the ground running, not building from the scratch. So I think that would be my guidance. If you're making a shift and you don't have some computational sort of foundations, I would figure out how to build those computational foundations.
I think we have time for one last question. This is the general one that I think many are thinking about, and it's how to explain a potential gap in research experience, because right now it is really tough to find RA positions. I think a more general version of that is whether it's current or just maybe you haven't quite done all the research you wished you had, not for lack of trying, but because those opportunities may not just have been there, especially depending on what college you went to. It's hard to get. How would you, and it's a challenge, it's a potential weakness. How do you address that in the application so that you don't get, screened out or overlooked?
I recommend being as upfront as possible about it. Anything that could be considered a red flag in your application, like you taking the lead and addressing it in your personal statement and like during the interviews and all of that, like upfront as soon as possible, is better than people assuming and making up stories and like, making up reasons why you didn't. And a big thing that you could do is like if you aren't able, to do research, finding alternative ways to get involved, right? Like even if you can't maybe do like a paid research experience, maybe if there's a lab that you could reach out to about like a research assistant position, if they do like journal club, right? Like trying to join in like virtually to their journal clubs or something, just something that shows that you are persistent and still wanting to achieve this goal, even if you weren't able to conduct research full time.
Great, thank you. All right, let me just ask each of you if there's any thing you'd say in closing, any sort of advice you give your regular students, anything we haven't touched on already. Covered a lot. I know we couldn't get quite to every question, but I think we got to the vast majority of them. Any closing thoughts from? Let me just offer each of you a chance. I don't know. Let's go. How about go? Anthony, Adriana, and Angeline.
Okay, I will keep it short and sweet. If you think this is something you're passionate about, throw in, remain optimistic. If you apply and you don't get in that first cycle, I know countless folks who did not get into grad school the first year they applied, who spent that subsequent year sort of filling in the gaps, and they got into many programs, including their dream programs. I can think of a member of my lab right now who didn't get in last year, who's now off to Berkeley in their dream lab, starting in the fall. So if it's something you're passionate about, throw in and stay optimistic. And it tends to work out.
Great advice. Adriana.
I think just do your homework also, both on your research questions and on the lab you want to join. I think more so than undergrad, the institution's reputation is important, but for your purposes, your day-to-day experience, it really is the individual lab and less so about, any reputation you may or may not know about an institution.
Dr. Dupes.
Yeah, I think all of that is really great advice. The persistence thing was the first thing that came to my mind when you had asked that. And it's that, not even just people applying once and not getting in. I know of folks who applied 2, 3 times before they got into graduate school. And the fact is, it is just so competitive now. Like it is a challenging thing to do. But if it's something that you want to do, you keep fighting for your dreams. Like you keep going, you find the support that you need, right? I think as an additional advice would be to find good mentors, finding people who are doing the things that you want to do, whether that's a current graduate student. It doesn't always have to be a faculty member, right? It could be a postdoc, it could be a graduate student, just someone who's made it to that next step you're trying to get to and they did it successfully, and asking them for advice and feedback on your applications and to do mock interviews with you. There are a lot of people who I'm sure are willing to help support you. It's just you have to ask for that help.
Well, this has been great advice and a great panel. There was a question about the recording. This will go up as soon as we can on the neuroxcareers.org website. I want to thank Dr. Dukes, Dr. Gavan, Dr. Wagner. I want to thank all of you, and of course, thank the Dana Foundation for making this possible. Good luck to everyone with your applications. If we can be of any use in the Career Network, reach out to us, info@neuroxcareers.org, and we'd be happy to help as well. Okay, thanks everyone. Good night. Have a great night.